Good morning, Faith Family, and welcome to the Daily Connection, a time when we get together in the Word, and more importantly, the Word gets into us. So we're starting our work week off in the Word of God. Congratulations, and thank you for doing that. And this week our topic is the problem of sin, and of course that title itself creates a bit of a problem as more and more we see the secular humanist overtake the predominant ideology in our world, the worldview, if you want to call it that. We see that they fail to realize, or they refuse to recognize, that man has an inherent problem that comes to us through birth and that originated in Adam and Eve. They reject that because at that point then you're acknowledging some sort of an origin and a creation. Of course, biblically speaking, we know that when God created, it was good. And it was in man rejecting God's goodness and disobeying God's word that sin comes into man. And from that point forward, the struggle. We have the fall, we have the curse, and therefore we have sin. But we need not directly connect that sin to God. And of course, that's the reason why James starts out in James chapter 1, verse 13 by saying, no one undergoing a trial should say, I'm being tempted by God, since God is not tempted by evil, and he himself doesn't tempt anyone. So that idea of no one who's undergoing, James is using emphatic right there, saying absolutely no way, no how are you to associate the idea of being tempted by evil with something that's originating in God. Now, in order to understand this verse correctly and why this verse was necessary, we have to put it into its context. Within the context of chapter 1, we see verse 12 says this: blessed is the one who endures trials, because when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. That word trials, same word used as trials and as tempted in verse 13. And of course, for the broader context of chapter 1, we can go all the way back to verse 2, which tells us, consider it a great joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you experience various trials, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its full effect, so that you may be mature and complete, lacking in nothing. And so one thing we need to point out is that no, God does not tempt, because as James says, God is not tempted by evil, nor does he use evil to tempt anyone. But that does not mean that God will not allow temptation to come to us in order to prove our faith, in order to demonstrate to us the weakness of our faith. After all, you go look at the opening verses. I think it was Matthew 4, where Jesus is led into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. God allowed that temptation to take place. Did it originate in God? No, it did not. But did God allow it? Yes, he did. Of course, in that sense, the temptation was there to prove that Jesus is indeed the divine Son of God. And whenever temptation comes to us, we do not see it as originating in God. We should not see it as originating in God. We should instead understand it as God allowing something to come into our life, or either God allowing us to be tempted by a desire or a pleasure or something we seek after in our life, but God allowing that temptation to prove us and to help us understand how weak we are to that, how susceptible we are to that, and how much we depend and need him. And of course, in terms of the problem of sin, it goes back to a reminder that yes, we are saved by grace through faith. We have been redeemed from the bondage of sin and the penalty for sin. But as Paul points out in Romans, we're still weak in our flesh. We are still susceptible to the desires of the flesh, which is where sin really does its biggest work. That's where Satan really targets in on those fleshly desires. And Satan will use those desires to lure us outside of the will of God for our life and the will of God and how we desire things. And so for us, number one, we understand God doesn't tempt anyone with evil. God is not tempted by evil. But yet it doesn't say that we won't undergo a trial. It says that as we are undergoing a trial. So that means that when we are tempted, we need to understand the origin is in Satan and in him trying to lure us outside the will of God, trying to, pervert what God created to be good, and how we utilize it or overutilize it or abuse it, and wherever you want to apply that. Because here's the thing, for most of us, well, let me stop. Because I can say for every single one of us, because none of us is Jesus, for every single one of us, there is a desire in our life, there is something going on in our life that Satan is using and will use to try to lure us outside the will of God. And God's going to allow that temptation. Why? To remind us that we are completely and utterly dependent upon him to overcome our struggles, and to remind us that we're not there yet. We have not arrived yet, There's still some sanctification to take place until we ultimately receive the glorification. So don't be discouraged by the trial. Don't be discouraged by the temptation. Instead, be encouraged that it didn't originate in God, but yet God is going to use that in order to refine us and to purify our faith, and more importantly, to conform us more to the image of Christ. So, brand new work week. Hope you're excited about the opportunities God has for you. And as you're heading out that door, remember as always, live sent.